On March 27, 1962, the state of New York announced it was taking 98 acres of downtown Albany, 40 city blocks, the oldest neighborhoods in a city that still operates under a charter signed in 1686, the oldest continuously active city charter in the United States. Over the next 2.5 years, 1,150 buildings came down, 4 churches, a synagogue, more than 300 businesses. Roughly 7,000 people were told to leave, close to 5% of everyone who lived in Albany. The original construction estimate was $250 million. By the time the last building in the complex opened its doors, the state had spent 8 times over budget to build it. This is the story of how the wealthiest family in America erased the oldest chartered city in America, one signature at a time. And what that signature is still costing the people who stayed. Chapter 1. The Charter. Rewind that signature. Not the one from 1962. The first one, the one every mayor and governor since has answered to. On July 22, 1686, in a small room in a Dutch trading town on the Hudson River, the royal governor of New York, Thomas Dongan, signed a charter granting the town the rights of a self-governing city under the English crown. 340 years later, that document has never been repealed, never replaced, never superseded by a new one. It is, in the plainest legal sense, still the operating charter of the city of Albany today. No other municipal government in the United States can make that claim about a document that old. Albany is the oldest continuously chartered city in the country, governing itself under the same piece of paper for longer than the United States has existed. The charter did not invent the place. It only put a British seal on something the Dutch had already built, abandoned, rebuilt, and renamed twice. In 1624, a small company of Dutch fur traders raised a fortified outpost on the west bank of the Hudson and called it Fort Orange. A wooden palisade wrapped around a warehouse for pelts, built for one purpose: buying beaver skins from Mohawk and Mohican trappers and shipping them downriver to Amsterdam. Fort Orange was not a city. It was barely a settlement, but it sat at the head of navigation on the Hudson, as far upriver as an ocean-going ship could reasonably travel, and that geographic fact would decide what the place became. Within 30 years, the trading post outgrew the fort's walls, and the growing village around it took a new Dutch name, Beverwijk, Beaver District. Named for the only commodity that mattered, the Dutch did not get to keep it. In 1664, an English fleet sailed into the harbor at New Amsterdam and took the entire colony without firing a shot that anyone bothered to record. Beverwijk was renamed Albany after the Duke of York and Albany, the future King James II. The English took the town. They did not take the people, or the houses, or the streets those houses stood on. Van Rensselaer money still owned nearly 1 million acres surrounding the settlement, a private feudal estate called Rensselaerswyck that answered to no city government at all. Dutch families, Van Rensselaer, Schuyler, Ten Broek, kept their land, their language, and their architecture longest of all. Steep, street-facing gables, narrow brick townhouses built end first to the road in the fashion of Amsterdam rather than London. The Quackenbush House, raised in the 1730s, still stands. So does the house at 48 Hudson Avenue, older still, the last timber-framed Dutch townhouse left in the city. Under an English charter, Albany kept building like Holland for 200 years. That Dutch stubbornness is the reason the Charter of 1686 mattered as more than paperwork. It gave a mixed, half-Dutch, half-English river town the legal standing of a city. Courts, a corporate government, a claim to permanence that a fort or a fur post never has. And permanence let Albany become something no one signing that charter could have planned for. In 1754, delegates from 7 colonies gathered in Albany's old Dutch town hall, the Stadhuis, to discuss a common defense against the French, Among them was a printer from Philadelphia named Benjamin Franklin. What came out of that meeting was the Albany Plan of Union, the first serious proposal to bind the separate American colonies into one government, drafted 22 years before those colonies declared independence. The plan failed. Not one colonial assembly ratified it, but the idea did not die in that room. It waited. By 1797, after 2 decades of the state legislature dragging itself between New York City, Poughkeepsie, and Kingston, lawmakers settled permanently in the same Dutch river town where Franklin had once sat. Albany became the capital of New York State, only the second state capital in the country still functioning continuously in that role. None of it made Albany rich. The charter, the gables, the printer from Philadelphia who had once sat in that room. That took water. Not the river the Dutch had already found in 1624, but a channel that did not exist yet. One no lawmaker in that chamber could yet imagine, that would turn a 3-century-old Dutch fur post into the busiest gate between the Atlantic Ocean and the entire American interior. Chapter 2. The Gateway. On October 26, 1825, a canal boat named the Seneca Chief pulled away from a dock in Buffalo, carrying 2 barrels of water drawn from Lake Erie, bound for New York Harbor along a channel that had taken 8 years to dig, the Erie Canal. Governor DeWitt Clinton rowed aboard it. The canal ran 363 miles through 83 locks and 18 aqueducts, dug largely by hand by men who had never built a canal before. Nobody in America had in 1817 when the digging started. On its eastern end, the canal met the Hudson at the same stretch of riverbank the Dutch had once loaded with beaver pelts. Albany sat at exactly that junction, and the junction rearranged the economics of a continent. The mechanism was straightforward. Everything moving between the Great Lakes and the Atlantic now passed through Albany in both directions, because there was no other route that made financial sense. A ton of freight hauled overland from Buffalo had cost roughly $100. By canal, the same ton cost $6, a drop of about 90%, steep enough to end overland freight hauling almost overnight. Grain, timber, wool, and whiskey moved east through Albany's docks. Settlers, tools, and manufactured goods moved west through the same channel. Albany manufactured little of what passed across its wharves. It did not need to. It took its cut and tolls, warehousing fees, and commissions on the entire trade of the American interior, and the cut alone was enough to build a city. Lumber showed the scale of it best. Within a decade of the canal's opening, the docks north of downtown had become a receiving ground for logs, cut across the Great Lakes watershed and rafted down to Albany to be sawn, graded, and sold. The lumber district had counted perhaps 6 wholesale dealers in the 1830s. By the 1870s, Albany was the largest wholesale lumber market in the United States by dollar value, not by volume. Chicago had already taken that title, but by the price its wood commanded. In 1865 alone, 3,963 sawmills operated within the district. The district itself ran more than 100 acres along the river, 500 feet wide at its southern edge and swelling to 1,150 feet at its northern end, stacked with cut pine for as far as the water could carry a raft. That trade paid for the monuments. The New York State Capitol took 32 years to build, from 1867 to 1899, and burned through 5 different architects in succession, each one's plans revised or overruled by the next man hired. It cost $25 million, the most expensive state government building of its era anywhere in the country. Governor Theodore Roosevelt finally declared it finished in 1899, 3 decades after the first stone was cut. 2 blocks away, the Delaware and Hudson Railroad raised its own monument between 1914 and 1918, a 13-story headquarters tower cut from stone in the Flemish Gothic style, deliberately built to echo the gabled Dutch houses still standing a few streets over, crowned with an 8-foot weather vane cast in the shape of Henry Hudson's ship, the Half Moon. South of all that granite, on the low ground running down toward the river, grew the neighborhood that fed the docks and swept the Capitol steps and cooked in the kitchens of the men who owned the lumber yards. Residents called it the Gut. Italian families ran groceries and barber shops along its side streets. Near the synagogue, Jewish merchants kept the dry goods stores. African-American families settled along Jefferson Street, close enough to the Capitol to hear its bells on the hour. Rooming houses belonged mostly to Irish and French families, packed in alongside elderly widowers living on fixed pensions. 4 churches anchored 4 different corners of the district. It was crowded, and it was poor by the standards of the men uphill. But it was a neighborhood in the fullest sense of the word. Grocers who knew their customers, mothers on adjoining stoops minding each other's children, while the men worked the docks, the sawmills, or the Capitol's endless scaffolding a few blocks north. A city that wealthy, built on top of a neighborhood that dense, was eventually going to draw someone who wanted to run both. In 1921 he arrived. Chapter 3. The Machine. In 1921 he arrived, not into the Capitol, and not into the mayor's office he would never hold, but into the back rooms, where the map of who kept the city's jobs and who lost them actually got drawn. Dan O'Connell was a private citizen that year, and he stayed a private citizen for the next 56 years. But in 1921, he engineered the campaign that put William Stormont Hackett in the mayor's chair and ended more than 2 decades of Republican rule under William Barnes Jr. The machine Barnes had built came apart. The machine O'Connell built to replace it did not run on speeches. It ran on names on a payroll. The mechanics behind it were simple enough to explain in a sentence. A man in the South End needed a job: clearing snow, inspecting scales, running a ward office, and the party found him one, on the condition that he delivered his precinct on Election Day. Multiply that arrangement across every ward in the city, and a party organization stops needing to win arguments. It only needs to keep count. O'Connell, who never sat in the mayor's chair, never needed to. The chair was downstream of the payroll, and the payroll was his. Historians who study American political machines would later call his one of the most durable the country ever produced, an organization built for endurance rather than spectacle. Hackett gave way in time to John Boyd Thatcher II, and Thatcher gave way in 1942 to a third mayor entirely. But the man who had put Hackett in the chair in 1921 was still the one deciding who ran under the party's banner 2 decades later. Erastus Corning II took that chair in 1942, and he did not let go of it until 1983. 41 years, 10 terms, the longest tenure of any mayor of a major American city in the country's history. He was not a South End ward boy. He was the great-grandson of the first Erastus Corning, who had founded the New York Central Railroad and had himself been mayor of Albany more than a century earlier, in the 1830s. The younger Corning left the city once to serve with the 2nd Infantry Division in the fighting across Europe, and came home to the same city, the same party, and eventually the same office his family's name had already occupied before the Civil War. Formal power sat with Corning for 41 years. Real power sat, for most of that time, with O'Connell and the ward leaders beneath him. A patrician mayor presiding over a city his party's machine actually ran. O'Connell died in 1977, 6 years before Corning did, and the organization he had spent 56 years assembling outlived him without pausing to notice. What that arrangement bought Albany was stability of a very specific kind. The same organization held the assessor's office through the Depression and a World War, under Democratic and Republican presidents alike, all the way to the year Corning finally died in it. Elections still happened on schedule. Ballots still got counted. But a government answerable mainly to itself has little reason to change what it governs, and through the middle decades of the century, Albany largely did not. While its own suburbs, filled with the ranch houses and shopping plazas rising across the rest of post-war America, more than a fifth of the city's population packed up and moved to them anyway. And the machine that ran the city they left behind kept running exactly as it always had. Nowhere held its shape longer than the South End. By the end of the 1950s, the district people still called the Gut looked much as it had for 2 generations. The same rooming houses, the same corner groceries, the same 4 churches, and the 1 synagogue, serving families who had lived on those blocks long enough to bury 1 generation and raise the next. Nobody was tearing it down. Nobody was building anything new in it either. It was a neighborhood the machine had never needed to touch, because the machine's business was votes, and the Gut delivered them reliably, year after year. In 1959, a new governor was sworn in at the Capitol above those same streets, carrying a surname that did not need an introduction anywhere in the country. Chapter 4. The Governor and the Architect. The surname was Rockefeller. Nelson Rockefeller took his oath as governor in January of 1959, grandson of one of the most powerful private fortunes the country had ever produced. Built out of Standard Oil by his grandfather, then spent for 4 decades by his father, who restored a colonial town in Virginia stone by stone and raised a Gothic church on the west side of Manhattan. Nelson had grown up inside that habit rather than beside it. His mother had helped found the museum in Manhattan, devoted to the modern painters he collected by the hundreds. Picasso, Leger, Matisse, names that would have filled a small museum on their own, and he came into office already convinced that a state proved itself in structures, not memoranda. He would spend the next 15 years raising more public buildings across New York than any governor before him. Albany, sitting directly beneath his office window, was simply the first one close enough to touch. His architect was already waiting. Wallace Harrison had built Rockefeller Center for Nelson's father in the 1930s, then spent the years after the war as the lead planner of the United Nations headquarters, raised on land the Rockefellers had personally donated to bring the organization to Manhattan. He was tied to the family by marriage, as well as by 3 decades of commissions. And by 1959, he functioned less like a hired designer than a standing advisor. The man Nelson called when an idea needed a shape. Sometime that year, flying between Albany and New York aboard the governor's plane, Rockefeller turned over a postcard, took out a pen, and sketched a plaza in a few strokes. A long open mall running south from the Capitol. Government towers along its edges, the whole idea small enough to fit in his palm before it ever touched a drafting table. Harrison took the sketch back to his office and began turning it into drawings. The story Albany still tells about how it began involves a Dutch princess. In September of 1959, Beatrix of the Netherlands rode through the city in an open car during a parade marking the anniversary of Henry Hudson's voyage up the river, and the route carried her past the rooming houses of the South End. Rockefeller, so the story goes, watched the poorest blocks of his own capital pass beneath a foreign princess's eyes and could not let it go. He is quoted as having said, "There's no question that the city did not look as I think the princess thought it was going to." The trouble with the story is its timing. The earliest newspaper column tying Beatrix's visit to any building plan did not run until March of 1962. 2 weeks before the state made the project official. 2.5 years after the princess had gone home, with no contemporary account from that September drawing any connection at all. Historians who have studied Rockefeller's years in Albany have said as much openly. The sequence reads less like a motive and more like a story assembled afterward, once a tidy origin was needed, for a decision that had already been made. What moved him needed no princess. Rockefeller passed the South End's rooming houses on his way to the Capitol every working day, and by 1959, he had already begun planning a building campaign that would eventually reshape college towns and government offices across the state. A poor, crowded neighborhood a few hundred feet from his own office did not fit that campaign. He wanted a structure of his own, on the scale of what his father and grandfather had already built, and Albany was the one city where he held the power to order it built. On March 27, 1962, the state made its intentions public. 98 acres, in the oldest part of Albany, 40 city blocks running south from the Capitol toward the river, were declared taken for the plaza Rockefeller and Harrison had sketched on the back of a postcard. But a governor cannot build a plaza on top of a living city. First, the city has to come down. And in the spring of 1962, on those 40 blocks, an entire neighborhood was still standing. Chapter 5. 98 acres. An entire neighborhood was still standing. The same rooming houses, and the same 4 churches, and the one synagogue that had anchored the district for 2 generations running. The same grocers and tailors and barber shops. People still called it the gut. Italian families lived beside Jewish families, beside Irish and French and Chinese families. With the black community concentrated along Jefferson Street, close enough to the Capitol to hear its bells on the hour. In March of 1962, none of that had changed yet. What had changed was the paperwork. The word the state used was appropriation, and the word did real legal work. Appropriation did not require the state to win an argument in court before it took a house, or negotiate a price before the crews arrived, or wait for an owner's consent at any stage. Title passed to the state of New York the moment officials declared the taking on March 27, 1962. Whether the person living inside had signed anything or not. Everything that might ordinarily come first, a hearing, an appraisal, a negotiation over price, was pushed to the far side of the wrecking crews to be settled later, if it was settled at all, once the building itself no longer existed. The crews started nearest the Capitol, where the state's claim ran deepest, and worked south and east from there through 1962, through 1963, into 1964. A rooming house came down. The grocery beside it went next. After that came the tailor's shop across the street, the barber shop beside it, the row of 2 family houses behind them, until a corner that had held people for 100 years held nothing but a foundation and a pile of brick waiting on a truck. Photographs taken from the same street corners months apart show entire blocks present in one frame and absent in the next. Not damaged, not half cleared, simply gone. The way a tooth is gone rather than broken. St. Paul's came down. So did St. Sophia's Greek Orthodox, whose congregation would rebuild years later out on Whitehall Road. So did the Church of the Assumption, which resettled eventually in Latham. A 4th church, First Methodist, came down with them, and so did the building that had once been Beth Emeth and was, by 1962, home to Wilbourn Temple, a black congregation. The Gut's last synagogue, gone with everything that had stood around it. By the time the crews finished, at the end of 1964, the tally stood at 1,150 buildings. Something close to 7,000 people, 1 in every 20 residents of the city, had been ordered out of homes some families had held for 3 generations. More than 300 businesses closed their doors or tried and mostly failed to reopen somewhere else. In a city that had just erased their old customers along with their old storefronts. Not everyone who lived through it left an account, but some did. And decades afterward, a project called 98 Acres in Albany collected what survived. A South End resident named Contis, remembering his father's decline in the years after the family was moved out, put it this way: I can't prove it, but I associate his decline with his world being taken out from under him. Fred Seal was 83 when the crews reached his block, a widower, a former guard at the Capitol he had once been able to see from his rooming house window. He was resettled in an apartment elsewhere in the city. He never adjusted to it. Compensation worked through paperwork. Residents and business owners filed claims for their moving costs, and the state paid what it judged those costs to be worth. What happened next is not in dispute. Once a block was cleared, it stayed cleared. Fenced, graded, held for towers that did not yet exist. Nobody moved back in 6 months or 6 years later because there was, by design, nothing left to move back into. By the last weeks of 1964, the 40 blocks were gone. 98 acres in the oldest chartered city in America sat empty, waiting for what Rockefeller and Harrison had sketched on the back of a postcard. The buildings were down, the people were gone. The bill for what would rise in their place had not yet been written, and under the Constitution of the state of New York, no voter would ever be asked to approve it. Chapter 6. The Arrangement. That bill had a legal problem long before it had a price. Article 7 of the New York State Constitution required a public referendum before the state could issue bonds of its own to pay for something this size. A vote of the state's entire electorate, not just Albany's. It was not a formality easily sidestepped by ordinary means. Governors before Rockefeller had watched large bond issues die at the ballot box, for reasons far less controversial than bulldozing the oldest chartered city in the state to build offices for the state government itself. Put the actual question to New York's voters. Erase a Dutch neighborhood so Albany could house more clerks. And the math on that referendum was already against him before a single ballot could be printed. The way around it came from a Wall Street lawyer named John Mitchell, who had spent his career finding the seams in state finance law wide enough to drive a bond issue through. Mitchell's invention had a name that sounded almost apologetic: the moral obligation bond. Instead of the state borrowing directly, a local government or public authority issued the debt, and the state merely pledged, without binding itself in a way the Constitution could reach, to cover the payments if that borrower ever came up short. A promise, not a guarantee. Applied to Albany, the idea became the deal that built the plaza. Albany County, not the state, would issue the bonds in amounts that ran well beyond any debt limit the county's own charter would ordinarily allow it to carry on its own credit. The state would not construct its own government buildings and simply own them. It would rent them for the length of the county's debt, paying what amounted to a lease on office towers built for its own employees, financed by a debt it had agreed never to formally hold. The plaza's legal owner of record became Albany County, not the state of New York, whose government would fill every floor of it. The county held title until 2001, 39 years after the first building on the site came down. None of it worked without the mayor. Albany County's bonding authority ran through the same political channel Corning's organization had controlled since 1921, and the county needed a willing hand to issue paper of that size against a government it effectively ran. Corning provided it. Albany County government, in practice, was Albany City government under a different letterhead. The same organization had staffed both since the 1920s, and the mayor's word carried as far in the county courthouse as it did in his own city hall. Corning sat down with Rockefeller and Mitchell and agreed to a structure that would, on his own signature, let the state build across his own city's oldest ground without a single Albany voter deciding the question either. In return, the machine that had spent 4 decades trading patronage jobs for votes now had something larger to trade: years of contracts and payroll running through a public works project of unmatched size in a city its organization had run since before most of the men signing the bonds were born. Allegations of graft trailed the procurement process for years afterward, the residue of that much construction money moving through channels one political organization still controlled. The mayor, whose oldest neighborhoods were being erased, had become the financial architect of their erasure. The man who signed the deal that decided who paid for tearing down his own city and who got to build what replaced it. No voter in Albany and no voter anywhere else in New York State ever cast a ballot on the plaza. The financing that built the largest government complex in the country ran entirely around the one mechanism democracy usually relies on to approve something this size. Decided in private, between a governor, a lawyer, and a mayor, then formalized through a county government answering to a machine that had never needed a referendum to stay in power in the first place. With the money arranged, the last obstacle was gone. What remained was simply the building of it. 11 years, poured in concrete and cut in marble, rising block by block over the ground where the gut had stood. Chapter 7. The Marble. Ground was broken on the cleared 40 blocks on June 21st, 1965, and for the next 11 years, contractors poured, cut, and set stone into towers that had existed until then only as lines on Wallace Harrison's drafting table. The estimate at groundbreaking was $250 million. The plan called for a scale of stone no state government building in the country had attempted. 5,000 tons of Vermont pearl marble went into cladding the tower at the plaza's center alone, quarried, cut, and set panel by panel over years of continuous work. 4 smaller towers rose along the same axis behind it, state agencies moving their staff in as each one was finished, so that for most of the 11 years the plaza was simultaneously a functioning seat of government and a construction site. When the center tower topped out, it rose 589 feet across 44 floors, the tallest building anywhere in New York State outside New York City, taller than anything else raised north of Manhattan in the 20th century. The last structure in the complex, a low, brutalist theater shaped like an egg balanced on its stem, would not be finished until 1978, 13 years after groundbreaking, 4 years after every other building around it had already opened its doors. The final bill, once contractors stopped submitting invoices, came to somewhere between $1,700,000,000 and $2 billion. The state never settled on one figure, and the accounts that tracked the spending still do not fully agree with each other. Overlapping contractor schedules slowed one crew behind another for years at a stretch, and several of the contractors caught in those delays later sued the state and won. Corruption allegations trailed the procurement process from groundbreaking to completion. Into the finished halls and lobbies, Rockefeller installed a collection of his own choosing, 92 paintings, sculptures, and tapestries, 16 of them commissioned specifically for the spaces they would occupy, gathered under his personal direction from the artists he had been collecting privately for decades. Jackson Pollock, Alexander Calder, and Mark Rothko among them. A public art collection selected entirely by one private eye. The plaza was formally dedicated on November the 21st, 1973. Rockefeller presided as the governor who had ordered it built 11 years earlier in the closing weeks of an office he was about to leave for good. Within weeks, he was gone from it entirely. It did not open to the public until the 1st through the 4th of July, 1976, in the middle of a state fiscal crisis, and by then the man who had sketched it on the back of a postcard held no office in New York State at all. He had signed the order that took the 98 acres as governor. He watched its doors open to the public as Vice President of the United States, a title that had come to him not from any ballot, but from a congressional vote 2 years earlier. The reviews arrived before the marble had finished settling. On July 2, 1976, one day after the plaza opened to the public, the New York Times ran architecture critic Paul Goldberger's verdict under the headline, "Mall Architecture, Futuristic Doesn't Work," calling the finished complex a compendium of cliches of modern architecture, not so much a vision of the future as of the past, whose ideas, he wrote, were dead before they left the drawing board. Robert Hughes, assessing the same buildings not long after, reached past questions of style entirely and named what he saw: the architecture of power, the kind of monumental government building that mid-century authoritarian states had once favored to make their own permanence visible in stone. Mayor Corning had already reached for the same comparison years before either critic did, telling a reporter that the project was something that might be expected of a dictatorship. He said it, and then he built it, inventing the very bond scheme that let the state raise it without a single voter's consent. The marble stood, 5,000 tons of it, cut and set and lit after dark above the ground where the gut had been. What the plaza had cost the city that built it was not yet tallied. Chapter 8. The Ledger. The account did not stay open. Here is where it settles. $15 million a year. Roughly what New York State has paid Albany annually since 2001, under a program called Payment in Lieu of Taxes, for the 98 acres taken in 1962 and never returned to the tax rolls. State property does not pay municipal tax, and between the plaza and everything else the state owns inside Albany, roughly a third of the city's land answers to no local tax bill at all. $15 million a year is the invoice for that signature, still arriving 6 decades later. No invoice ever included the cost of the neighborhood itself. The neighborhood was only ever part of a larger count. Albany's population peaked in 1950 at 134,995. By 2020, it stood at 99,224, about a quarter smaller. The plaza had been built for commuters, not residents. Arrive, work a shift, drive home before dark. By the time construction wrapped, downtown Albany had lost both department stores, its last movie theater, and dozens of the restaurants that once kept its sidewalks occupied after 6 in the evening. Most evenings, they still are not. Not everyone accepts that verdict. William Kennedy, Albany's own Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist, told a reporter in 1997 that the mall had preserved the city. That whatever it cost the neighborhood beneath it, it kept the state's money and jobs from leaving Albany the way almost everything else eventually did. Rockefeller did not stay to watch any of it settle. He resigned the governorship in December 1973, months before the plaza was dedicated, and a year later, in December 1974, was sworn in as Vice President of the United States, appointed under an amendment barely a political generation old, the first time neither the president nor the vice president in office had been elected to it. He died on the night of January 26, 1979, in his Manhattan townhouse at 58, in circumstances his family's first public account of that night did not entirely survive. The demolition left one thing behind nobody in 1962 had planned for: a reflex. 2 blocks from where the wrecking crews stopped, the Center Square Neighborhood Association, organized in 1958, used the lesson the city had just been taught to block a parking lot and a fast food franchise in the 1970s. Its Dutch-era row houses still stand today partly because of it. When the state later proposed extending the South Mall arterial west, residents formed the Hudson/Park Neighborhood Association and stopped it before it took a second bite. In Arbor Hill, the 13-acre 10-broke triangle won a place on the National Register in 1979, under the same preservation law that had arrived too late for the gut. None of it brought back what was gone. What it produced decades later was a project called 98 Acres in Albany, running since 2014, recording the memories of anyone who could still describe living on those 40 blocks before 1962. No apology has ever been issued. Not by the state that took the land, not by the city whose own mayor helped finance the taking. What arrived instead, decades later, was a budget line: $400 million under Governor Kathy Hochul for a downtown investment plan that includes a project formally named Reconnect the Empire State Plaza. the state now paying to stitch the plaza back into the city its own governor once cut it out of. The charter signed July 22, 1686, is still, in the plainest legal sense, in force. Albany governs itself under it today, the oldest continuously active city charter in the United States, signed 90 years before the nation, whose flag flies over the plaza it authorized, had even declared independence. Under the marble of the 4 blocks the towers stand on, the streets that charter once governed are still down there, buried rather than erased, the way a foundation survives under a parking lot long after the building on top of it is gone. A few streets north, on the roof of a converted warehouse, a 28-foot fiberglass dog has sat since 1958, ears up, head cocked toward a phonograph horn that stopped playing decades ago. From up there, Nipper has had a clear view down Broadway toward the marble towers since before the first building in the gut came down. He is still listening. Nothing plays.